The air compressor hissed like an angry serpent in the damp Breton night. Sergeant Bob Tomkins, 27 years old and running on 72 hours of cold coffee and nerves, watched the silhouette of a 33-ton Sherman tank emerge from a canvas sack. Except it wasn't steel, it was rubber. At 10 p.m. on August 23, 1944, 2 kilometers from the outer fortifications of Fortress Brest, Tomkins and the 603rd Camouflage Engineers were committing the perfect bluff. Their mission? Convince General Hermann Bernhard Romke and his 38,000 battle-hardened paratroopers that the U.S. 8th Corps had 2 full tank battalions poised to strike his right flank. The reality was 1,100 men, a handful of real vehicles, and tons of inflatable decoys. Tomkins felt the eyes on him. Earlier, through his binoculars, he'd spotted 2 German observers in the church tower of Gipavas, their own lenses glinting in the sunset. They were watching. The entire deception hinged on them seeing this. "Make it convincing, Sergeant," Captain Oscar Seal whispered, moving to the next inflation point. "Dawn's their photo op." Tomkins nodded, his mind replaying the 4 previous operations. 0 tanks destroyed. Their only weapon was belief. By 0330 hours, a ghostly armored company took shape in the field. 15 M4 Shermans, each a 93-pound masterpiece of painted rubber and clever bracing. From 500 yards, the illusion was perfect. Convincing shadows, dummy guns, even fake tread marks pressed into the mud by Private James Anderson and a bulldozer. A sound truck hidden in a copse of trees began playing a vinyl recording of tank engines idling and sergeants barking orders, volume carefully calculated to reach German listening posts. This was the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit of artists, engineers, radio wizards, and a fashion designer, their average IQ 119, now fighting a war of perception under real artillery range. By 0647, the first gray light of August 24th crept over the hedgerows. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane appeared precisely at 0647. It made 2 low, slow passes. Cameras clicked. The men held their breath, pressed against the cold earth, their fate now in the hands of a German photo interpreter. By noon, 8th Corps intercepts confirmed it. German command was urgently repositioning 20 to 50 dreaded 88mm anti-tank guns. The deception had worked spectacularly. But the radio intercept carried a chilling addendum. The guns were being sighted directly on the field where Tomkins' rubber tanks stood. Success had not made them invisible. It had painted a perfect target on their backs. 6 months earlier, and a world away from the front, the Ghost Army was just a radical idea sketched on a classified memo. In a London office cluttered with reconnaissance photos, Major Ralph Ingersoll and Colonel Billy Harris studied images from North Africa, British dummy tanks that had fooled Rommel. For the impending D-Day invasion to succeed, Hitler had to be misled on an industrial scale. But the U.S. Army had no doctrine for tactical deception, no manual, and no unit. They needed to invent one from scratch. The core problem was personnel. Traditional soldiers fought with bullets. This new unit would fight with illusion. Who could convincingly lie to an entire army? Harris proposed an unorthodox solution: recruit creative minds. They scoured service records for artists, architects, sound engineers, set designers, and advertisers, men who understood perception, shadow, and psychology. They found them: a 23-year-old fashion illustrator named Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, and future photographer Art Kane. They were drafted not as cannon fodder, but as architects of a new kind of warfare. By January 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated, a bizarre fusion of West Point graduates and art school dropouts, their average IQ an astonishing 119. They were given a simple, impossible mandate: learn to fake an army. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, they entered a surreal boot camp. Under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, they traded rifles for air compressors and learned to assemble a 93-pound rubber Sherman in 20 minutes flat. Engineers from Goodyear delivered the inflatables, tanks, trucks, artillery that looked real from 500 yards but would collapse if leaned on. The Sonic Company experimented with massive speakers on trucks, playing vinyl recordings of armored columns, trying to find the perfect volume to deceive German listening posts miles away. Radio operators, the unit's nervous system, practiced mimicking the exact communication styles of real divisions, down to an operator's unique fist, the rhythmic keying signature that could betray an imposter. They trained relentlessly, but it was a theater rehearsal with no guarantee of an audience. Doubt was their constant companion. Would any of this work under actual artillery fire? As they boarded the USS Henry Gibbons for England in May 1944, Sergeant Tompkins, now a camouflage engineer, looked at his fellow soldiers, a mechanic, a window dresser, a cartoonist. They were not infantry. Their weapon was a shared, audacious secret. The twist came when they learned their first mission in Europe, not to support the D-Day landings directly, but to stay behind. While thousands stormed the bloody beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army was ordered to remain in England, inflating practice tanks in a field. The crushing irony was immediate. They had been crafted as the ultimate weapon of deception, and for the war's most critical moment, command deemed them too untested, too precious, or perhaps too strange to risk. The reality of war hit them not with a bang, but with the overwhelming stench of decay and cordite. The Ghost Army arrived on the Normandy beaches in late June 1944, weeks after D-Day. The serene fields of Camp Forest were replaced by a shattered landscape of burnt-out tanks and churned earth. Their first mission was a humble nighttime test: simulate a mulberry artificial harbor with lights to draw German artillery away from the real ones. It failed, lost in the Allied Army's own light pollution. But it taught a vital lesson: the enemy was watching, always. Their training was now a deadly serious game. The pressure shifted from their artistic commanders to men like Sergeant Bob Tomkins. It was one thing to inflate a tank in Tennessee, another to do it knowing a German 88mm gun, its crew alerted by a suspicious observer, could fire at any moment. The unit's first casualties came not from a failed deception, but from random shelling. 3 men wounded by shrapnel while erecting dummy supply dumps. There were no front lines here, only degrees of danger. The artists, designers, and radio operators had to learn the soldiers' most fundamental skill: digging a foxhole deep enough to save your life. Their first major test, Operation Brittany, in August, was a strategic masterpiece. As Patton's Third Army raced east, the Ghost Army was tasked with creating phantom divisions, the 35th, 80th, and 90th Infantry, to convince German intelligence a major thrust was heading south into the Breton Peninsula. For 4 days, they executed a full-spectrum illusion. Radio operators filled the airwaves with the meticulously copied traffic of entire divisions. Sound trucks broadcast the roar of tank columns moving at night. Jeeps with freshly painted unit insignia visited local cafes, their crews casually dropping false information. The deception worked flawlessly. German forces repositioned to counter the non-existent threat, allowing Patton's real spearheads to advance with less resistance. Back at headquarters, it was hailed as a triumph of tactical cunning. But in the field, the men drew a darker conclusion. Private James Anderson, the mechanic from Virginia, scrawled in his secret diary, "We're not magicians, we're bait." Success meant they had drawn the enemy's gaze and his gun sights directly onto themselves.
the brilliant illusion that protected thousands of real soldiers simultaneously painted a target on the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army. Their baptism by fire was complete. They had learned that in this war of perception, the most convincing decoy was also the primary target.
The radio intercept was the signal of their success and their impending doom. By noon on August 24th, Captain Oscar Seal confirmed that German command had taken the bait, ordering between 20 and 50 88mm anti-tank guns to reposition and face the threatening armored battalions. For Sergeant Bob Tomkins, crouched in a hedgerow, the victory felt hollow. Each of those high-velocity guns was now being zeroed in on his field, on the coordinates provided by the observers in the Geepavost church tower. The rubber Shermans, which had seemed like clever props just hours before, now felt like grotesque tombstones marking their own graves. The Ghost Army had accomplished its mission. It had drawn fire. But the crucial, unspoken second part of the mission began now, to disappear before that fire landed. They had to hold the illusion until the last possible moment, maintaining radio silence and visible presence for any lingering German reconnaissance, all while preparing to vanish into the Breton night. The discipline required was nerve-shredding. Playing dead is easy. Playing alive when you know the executioner is loading his rifle is an art form of pure courage. At 0400 on August 25th, under a cloak of absolute darkness, the Ghost Army performed its most delicate operation, making an entire armored battalion evaporate. Working with silent, rehearsed precision, Tomkins and his team opened valves on the inflatable tanks, their proud silhouettes sagging into piles of limp rubber and canvas. The sound truck crept away, its vinyl records of engine noise replaced by the real sounds of the approaching battle, the distant thunder of the preliminary artillery barrage for the 8th Corps' real assault on Brest. Trucks carried away the deflated decoys. Bulldozers smoothed over the fake tread marks. By first light, the field was empty. Just hours later, the German 88mm shells began to rain down, pounding empty earth with furious precision. The redirected German guns had weakened the center of the line. When the real attack began, the U.S. 709th Tank Battalion, the real unit that had lent a skeletal force to the deception, reported unexpectedly light resistance on their flank. The Ghost Army had not just fooled the enemy, they had actively shaped the battlefield. Their rubber shield had worked, sparing unknown numbers of American tank crews. But as Tomkins looked back at the smoke rising over the distant field, he knew their greatest weapon was no longer the inflatable tank, but their newfound understanding. Success was measured in the shells wasted on their ghosts. The orders that arrived in September 1944 were their most terrifying yet. Patton's Third Army was advancing on the fortress city of Metz, but its lines were stretched paper-thin. A dangerous gap had opened between two real divisions. If German forces probed and discovered this weakness, they could slice through, cut off an entire American corps, and jeopardize the entire offensive. The Ghost Army was ordered to be the only thing filling that void. For 7 days, 1,100 men would have to impersonate the entire 6th Armored Division, 15,000 soldiers, along a critical sector near Bettendorf. There were no real combat units behind them, no fallback position. Lieutenant Robert Hiller, commanding the Sonic platoon, positioned his speaker trucks just behind the nominal front. As dusk fell on September 15th, he gave the signal. The night erupted with the recorded roar of tank engines, the clatter of treads, and the shouts of sergeants mustering phantom companies. For the German listening posts a kilometer away, it sounded like an entire armored division was digging in. The men on the ground, armed only with carbines, listened to the convincing audio and felt a surreal vulnerability. They were creating a Potemkin army, and the entire front's stability depended on the quality of their performance.
The operation became a high-wire act of relentless psychological pressure. Radio operators, working in shifts around the clock, generated thousands of fake messages, routine supply requests, maintenance reports, and reconnaissance patrol updates, all mimicking the 6th Armored's precise communication patterns. Men drove jeeps back and forth along visible roads, kicking up dust. They painted and repainted division insignia, visited local villages in small groups to spread misinformation. German artillery responded with sporadic, harassing fire. Shells would land randomly in the sector, not aimed at specific targets, but a constant reminder of the audience's presence. On the third night, an 88mm airburst shattered near one of Hiller's sound trucks, wounding 3 engineers with shrapnel. They were patched up in silence. Even medical evacuations had to be done covertly to maintain the illusion of a robust, unharmed division. The twist came not from a German breakthrough, but from internal collapse. After 5 days of unremitting tension, one of the radio operators, Private Dennis Klein, began to stutter uncontrollably during a transmission, a breach of procedure that could have betrayed their ruse. He was quietly relieved and spent the remainder of the mission in a shaking, silent stupor. The Ghost Army had held the gap, but the cost was now measured in frayed nerves and the quiet, invisible wounds of men who fought a war of perpetual, screaming pretense.
December 19th, 1944. The frozen fields of Luxembourg echoed not with tank fire, but with the frantic chatter of Morse code. In a farmhouse cellar, Sergeant George Kress and his team of radio operators were the only reinforcements the besieged 101st Airborne had. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last desperate gamble, and it was working. German panzers had shattered the front, surrounding Bastogne. With no real reserves left, General Bradley's staff issued a wild order to the Ghost Army: create 2 entire phantom divisions, the 75th Infantry and the 6th Armored, and make German intelligence believe they were moving to counterattack the southern flank of the German Bulge. Codenamed Operation Kodak, it was a purely electronic deception, their most dangerous mission yet. The Ghost Army's position was perilously fluid. German spearheads were everywhere. Setting up their powerful transmitters, Kress and his men knew they were making themselves the brightest electronic beacon for German direction-finding vans. They were not just bait, they were broadcasting a bullseye on themselves in the hope the enemy would aim at the wrong target. For 4 critical days, the airwaves crackled with the synthetic life of 20,000 non-existent soldiers. Radio operators, their fingers stiff with cold, transmitted a symphony of falsehoods. The 75th requesting grenade resupply, the 6th Armored reporting tank engine failures in the snow, fake battalion commanders coordinating attacks. Every transmission had to be perfect, mimicking the unique fist and procedural quirks of the units they impersonated. They worked in unheated trucks, vacuum tubes shattering in the frost, the constant fear not of an infantry assault, but of a radio triangulation followed by a barrage of artillery. The strain was immense. Meanwhile, at Bastogne, the real 101st Airborne, low on ammo and medical supplies, held on by a thread. The breakthrough came not on the ground, but in the ether. German intelligence, intercepts later captured, confirmed the ruse had worked. Enemy commanders reported the arrival of strong, fresh forces south of the Bulge and adjusted their plans, hesitating and diverting resources for 4 precious days. It was the exact window George Patton needed. His Third Army, driving north in a brutal forced march, broke through to Bastogne on December 26th. The siege was lifted. The Ghost Army received no accolades, their victory invisible, etched only in enemy radio logs and the lives of the men they had helped save without firing a single shot. By March 1945, the Ghost Army were masters of their surreal craft, but the stakes had never been higher. Their final, greatest performance was Operation Viersen. The mission, convinced the German command that the U.S. Ninth Army's main assault across the Rhine would strike at the town of Viersen, not at the actual crossing point of Wesel, 15 miles to the south. For this, they deployed their full arsenal on an industrial scale. Sergeant Tompkins and the 603rd inflated over 600 vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery, creating a phantom corps in muddy fields. Sonic trucks played a 24-hour symphony of construction and armor movement. Radio operators simulated the bustling traffic of 2 full divisions. They knew the script by heart, but this audience was the most desperate. The German defenses were concentrated, fanatical. Almost immediately, the response came not in the form of confused intelligence reports, but in savage, concentrated artillery fire. 155mm shells began tearing into their carefully arranged stage, wounding men and shredding the rubber decoys they were still trying to inflate. For the first time, the deception felt less like a clever trick and more like a desperate provocation of a wounded beast. They were ordered to hold position under the bombardment, maintaining the illusion even as the very tools of that illusion were being destroyed around them. For 3 agonizing days, they endured the shelling, repairing inflatables under fire and transmitting fake messages as craters erupted around their trucks. The German reconnaissance flights came constantly, and the men took morbid solace in every Luftwaffe pass. It meant the bait was still being taken. On March 24th, the real crossing at Wesel began. The reports that filtered back were a strange reward. Resistance was unexpectedly light. German reserves had indeed been diverted north towards the Ghost Army's phantom threat. General William Simpson of the Ninth Army sent a personal commendation. Their illusion had saved thousands of real lives. The mission was a monumental success. Yet, as they deflated their bullet-riddled tanks for the last time, the mood was hollow. The twist was not in the operation, but in its aftermath. The men, expecting orders for the next show, were instead met with a sudden, deafening silence. The Rhine was crossed. The German heartland lay open. The war of maneuver had replaced the war of static lines, where deceptions worked. As they sat in the sudden quiet, the relentless artillery fire replaced by an eerie calm, they understood the unspoken truth. Their war was over. The masters of illusion had finally crafted themselves out of a job.
Victory in Europe brought no parades for the Ghost Army. Instead, in a quiet field in Luxembourg in May 1945, Colonel Harry Reeder assembled his 1,100 men and delivered their final, most critical order: silence. Their records were classified top secret, their equipment was to be destroyed or locked away, and every man was to sign a binding non-disclosure agreement. They were forbidden from speaking of their service, even to family or fellow veterans, on pain of court-martial. The reason was coldly logical. The techniques they had perfected, sonic warfare, inflatable deception, radio spoofing, were considered invaluable for the next war, the Cold War that was already gathering. Sergeant Bob Tomkins returned to his family and simply said he had been an engineer. Private James Anderson, the mechanic, locked his diary away for 70 years. The artists among them, Bill Blass, Ellsworth Kelly, returned to their crafts, carrying an immense, unspeakable secret. They had saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 lives, shaped the outcomes of historic battles, and yet they were erased from the official narrative. Their greatest deception became their own invisibility in history, a final ghost operation that lasted half a century. The truth began to seep out only in 1996, when the Pentagon declassified the unit's records. In 2013, a PBS documentary finally told their story. But for most, recognition came too late. The ultimate twist of their tale arrived in 2024, when the dwindling handful of survivors, men like Seymour Nussbaum and Bernard Bluestein, all over 95 years old, were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. Senator Edward Markey hailed them as men not only of muscle, but of the mind. The inflatable Sherman displayed in the National World War II Museum, a 93-pound rubber relic, stands as a monument to their strange, brilliant war. Their true legacy, however, is not in a museum. It lives on in every modern military deception doctrine, in every electronic warfare tactic, in the understanding that creativity can be as decisive as firepower. The Ghost Army proved that in war, the most powerful weapon is sometimes a perfect lie, and the strongest soldiers are those who can carry the weight of an unforgettable truth in eternal silence.